Hello and welcome to this edition of World at War. I'm your host, Mohammed Saleh. The battle for Taiwan has the potential to define the world order of the 21st century. Will Pax Americana continue to reign, or will the world transition to a new order under Pax Sinica? Because remember, the American policy for the last decade has been about the containment of China. The Taiwan War will pit the two biggest superpowers of our time, with the use of weapons and technology unlike any that we've witnessed so far. But at what point and under what circumstances will China actually attack Taiwan? This is a question that has gripped military analysts and policymakers in Washington. China began this year with yet another incident of 57 of its warplanes testing Taiwan's air defense preparedness by flying dangerously close to the Taiwanese airspace. The Chinese warplanes included the likes of the J-10, the J-11, the J-16, the Su-30, the H-6 bombers, besides other early warning and reconnaissance aircraft. For its part, Taiwan responded by putting its naval vessels, its fighter jets and land-based missile systems on high alert. Just 3 days prior to that, the American destroyer, the USS Changhoon, of the U.S. Navy's 7th Fleet transited through the Taiwan Strait as part of the Freedom of Navigation operations. With every passing month, a conflict in the Taiwan Strait appears more and more imminent. But how will a Chinese invasion of Taiwan play out? An American think tank, the Center for Strategic and International Studies, this week created a stir. In its war game simulation, it concluded that a Chinese invasion of Taiwan would most probably fail if the United States, along with its close ally Japan, were to get involved.
Good evening, everyone.
The American think tank predicts that the invasion would happen in 2026. A total of 24 different wargaming scenarios were tested. China would begin the invasion with the heavy bombardment to destroy Taiwan's air and naval bases. The Chinese Navy would then try to encircle the Taiwanese island and will begin ferrying a landing force of thousands of PLA soldiers. Simultaneously, with a missile blitz, China would target the American air bases in Japan and even as far as Guam. 2 American aircraft carriers, along with at least about 20 other destroyers and cruisers of the Americans, would be sunk. But the Americans would counterattack with their submarines, fighter jets and bombers, along with the Japanese forces to cripple the Chinese amphibious assault. In the end, the American think tank has predicted that China's invasion would be repulsed and Taiwan will remain autonomous. But Global Times, the Chinese mouthpiece, has rubbished these war game simulations as nothing more than fear-mongering, propaganda by the US military-industrial complex to sell more weapons to American allies in the region. But what is also interesting to note is that the conclusions of the American think tank are in stark contrast to the wargaming assessments that have been made by the Pentagon in recent years. Since 2020, the Pentagon has admitted that China has already amassed enough ballistic and hypersonic missiles that every US base and American carrier battle group operating in the Indo-Pacific Command would be vulnerable to Chinese missile strikes, including the Pacific island of Guam, where America has stationed its strategic bombers such as the B-2 and B-52, which are now considered to be in the crosshairs of the Chinese missiles. General Mark Milley, the American chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, has admitted to the changing power balance in the Pacific Ocean.
If you look at, again, 40 years ago, they had zero satellites. Look at what they've got today. They had no ICBMs. Look at what they've got today. They had no nuclear weapons. Look what they got today. They have no 4th or 5th generation fighters or even more advanced fighters back then. Look what they got today. They had no Navy. Look what they have today. They had no subforce. Look what they have today. So if you look at the totality, this test that occurred a couple weeks ago is only one of a much, much broader picture of a military capability with respect to the Chinese that is very, very significant. We're witnessing, in my view, we're witnessing one of the largest shifts in global geostrategic power.
According to Admiral Philip Davidson, the former chief of the US Indo-Pacific Command, 2026 is the year where the Chinese military build-up will overmatch the American presence in the Pacific region. But China may not wait that long. To deter a direct involvement by the United States, China would not even need to eclipse the American defense capabilities in the Pacific. Some military analysts predict that China might stage a showdown as early as 2024, while others believe that Xi Jinping will invade into Taiwan in 2027. But what the military analysts are getting wrong is that they are relying only on defense capabilities to predict the impending flashpoint in the Taiwan Strait. As things stand, Taiwan is the hub of nearly about 90% of the manufacturing capacity for the world's most advanced semiconductors. These semiconductor chips, which Taiwan manufactures, are so crucial that any disruption in their production will cause a global meltdown, and it would debilitate the Chinese economy. Since 2014, China has been the biggest importer of Taiwan semiconductors. As of 2021, China imported semiconductors to the tune of a staggering $430 billion, of which 36% came from Taiwan. Taipei refers to its semiconductor manufacturing foundries as its silicon shield. To break away from the Taiwanese stranglehold on semiconductors, China in December 2022 announced an investment of 1 trillion yuan, the equivalent of $143 billion, for setting up high-end chip manufacturing plants on the Chinese mainland. For its part, the United States has also announced an investment of about $200 billion to ramp up its domestic semiconductor production in America. More than any other territory, Taiwan recognizes that semiconductor chips don't just bring financial security to the island, but also guarantee its national security. So contrary to what the military generals are predicting, it won't be China's military overmatch of the United States, but rather China's ability to break its dependence on the Taiwanese semiconductor chips that will dictate the timelines of a war in the Taiwan Strait. There are reports in the American media that Russian artillery fire is down by almost about 75%. But how true are these reports? As similar such assessments about Russia's declining arsenal have been doing the rounds since August last year. On the battlefield, though, Russia has claimed to have captured the town of Soledar. What impact will this have on the theatres of war in Ukraine? Our next report gets you more details.
The cruel winter has frozen the battle lines, but the ferocity of the war has not abated. This video, posted by the Ukrainian Defense Ministry, will give you a glimpse of what is unfolding in the battle for Bakhmut. For months, the Russian mercenary Wagner Group has been relentless in its offensive to capture the city. But the dogged Ukrainian defense, fortified by Western weapons, has refused to break. But in nearby Soledar, Moscow has managed to oust the defending Ukrainian forces from the salt mine city. The fighting for the small but strategic town has been described as one of the bloodiest in the war. Barely any walls in Soledar are said to be standing.
On the evening of January 12th, the liberation of Soledar was completed. The town is important for continuing the Russian advance on the Donetsk axis.
But Volodymyr Zelensky has disputed the Russian claims. According to the Ukrainian president, Kiev is fighting back firmly against the Russian onslaught.
Today, I would like to specifically mention the paratroopers from the 77th Separate Airborne Brigade that, together with the fighters from the 46th Separate Airborne Brigade, held their position in Soledar and inflicted significant losses on the enemy.
Curiously, reports have emerged in the American media that Russia's artillery fire is dramatically down by almost 75% in comparison to its wartime high. On an average, Russia was estimated to have been firing 20,000 shells per day in the battlefield. Ukraine could respond by an average of 7,000 artillery shells per day. It is not possible to independently verify the claims of the Russian artillery firing fewer shells. But what is clear is that both Russia and the West have ordered their respective defense manufacturing companies to crank up production. But bear in mind, the Ukraine war is not a traditional contest of artillery guns. It is electronic warfare with the use of radars, jammers, low-cost drones, and surveillance satellites, which will ultimately decide the winner. And Ukraine, with the use of Western weapons, appeared to have the technological advantage in its counter-offensive. In the bitter fighting during the winter, has barely managed to push Russia back.
Armata! A democracy crumbles not because of an external threat, but often due to internal rifts where contending parties seek to subvert the institutions of a democracy. On the 8th of January, thousands of Jair Bolsonaro supporters stormed into the presidential palace, the Congress, and also the Brazilian Supreme Court. There was rioting on the streets. Wrapped in the Brazilian flags, Bolsonaro supporters were demanding for freedom and democracy. But what did these protesters actually want? And why has this incident in Brazil brought back the bitter memories of the Capitol Hill insurrection by the Trump supporters?
8th of January 2023 will go down as a dark day in Brazilian history. Thousands of Jair Bolsonaro supporters who proudly carried the Brazilian flag and chanted the slogans "Freedom" and "Democracy" stormed the Brazilian parliament. This was no ordinary protest. This was an attempt to capture the seat of power in Brazil. Protesters had climbed atop the parliament building, clashed with the riot police. Tear gas was launched, helicopters hovered in the sky. Hundreds of Bolsonaro supporters who had come to occupy the parliament were handcuffed and arrested. But this was just the beginning of the insurrection. The Brazilian flag has the words "Order and Progress" written on it. But what played out at the presidential palace was complete disorder and the subversion of law. The palace was ransacked, furniture broken, paintings and murals disfigured. The protesters then turned their attention to the Brazilian Supreme Court. They smashed their way inside the building as the outnumbered police lost complete control of the situation. President Lula da Silva, who had just been inaugurated on the 1st of January and who was out of the capital at the time of the insurrection, dubbed this an attempted coup.
Que foi aprovada pelos 27 governadores.
They were shouting for a coup. This was the only thing one could hear, that they were shouting for a coup. When the former president of the Republic, Jair Bolsonaro, left office without a handover, and when the vice president Geraldo Alckmin made a statement on television, they started to attack generals and attack the vice president by calling him a coward and that he had betrayed the whole movement.
Eventually, the anti-riot police managed to bring the situation under control. Tents pitched by Bolsonaro supporters were dismantled. But curiously though, Jair Bolsonaro himself was not present in the country when his supporters vandalized the government buildings. He posted this picture of himself in Florida, United States, where he was admitted in a hospital due to abdominal pain. Bolsonaro has often been described as the Trump of the tropics. The attack on state institutions by his supporters has been compared to the 6th of January Capitol Hill riots, when Donald Trump supporters had stormed the Congress. Just like Bolsonaro's supporters, Trump's supporters too wanted to overturn the results of an election. But the political turmoil in Brazil has not ended yet.
We'll fight again. We'll rest and prepare for the new fight. Because if they think they are going to intimidate us with that, they are completely wrong.
At the moment, Brazil is a divided nation. The tremors of the October presidential election, which Lula won with a very slender margin, haven't subsided yet. Bolsonaro has not even considered the election and continues to insist that the results were stolen from him.
Six people, including a police officer, were wounded in a knife attack in central Paris. Of the injured, one person is said to have suffered some grievous injuries. The early morning attack took place at the busy Gare du Nord railway station. Now, responding swiftly, the police is reported to have shot the unidentified attacker several times. The motive of the attack has still not been established. Our next report gets you the details.
Gare du Nord train station is one of the busiest commuter stations in Paris, servicing about 700,000 passengers every single day. It links the French capital with London, Brussels and other North European cities. On Wednesday morning, though, an eerie calm had engulfed the station. Dozens of police officers were huddled nearby the Eurostar terminal entrance, and the area was cordoned off for the public. The reason? An unprovoked knife attack during the early morning rush hour. The deadly attack led to serious disruptions in train services. Along with the Parisian mayor, Anne Hidalgo, Interior Minister Gérald Darmanin rushed to the spot.
At 6:42 a.m., an extremely threatening individual started attacking people outside and then inside the Gare du Nord station. And at 6:43, he was neutralized by the police officers. Two officers shot 3 times and managed to neutralize the threatening individual, who managed to injure 6 people, one more severely, even though he is not in a life-threatening condition. He is in hospital. Among the 6 injured, there is a police border officer. Without the extremely rapid intervention, there would surely have been deaths.
The identity of the attacker, who is said to be in his 30s, has not been disclosed, and the motive at the moment is unclear. According to eyewitnesses, the suspect did not say anything during the assault. Any extremist links have not been discovered by the investigators so far. Shot in the chest by the police, the assailant is said to be between life and death in hospital. Curiously, though, the case is being investigated not as a terror attack, but as an act of crime. Just last month, a 69-year-old gunman, William Mallet, in a racist hate crime, opened indiscriminate fire and killed 3 Kurds at a Kurdish community center in the heart of the French capital, Paris. What is interesting to note is that the site of the December attack is not far from the Gare du Nord railway station. The French policymakers have an unenviable task of addressing the issue of identity, race and culture, which have continued to fester and breed hatred and violence.
The Tigray rebels are now surrendering their heavy weapons to the Ethiopian federal government. The surrender of weapons was central to the ceasefire deal that was signed in November. The restoration of essential services, the resumption of humanitarian aid, and the withdrawal of Eritrean troops are other key elements of this peace deal. The conflict, remember, has dragged on for over 2 years in northern Ethiopia. Thousands have been killed, millions have been displaced, and this war in northern Ethiopia has been described as one of the deadliest conflicts of the 21st century. But does the surrender of weapons by the Tigrayan forces mean that peace will finally prevail in Ethiopia?
Fighting broke out in November 2020 when Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed deployed the Ethiopian army in the Tigray province in a bid to crush the rebellion by the Tigrayan leaders, who he claimed had challenged his authority for months. In addition to this, he also accused them of attacking federal military bases. As a result of the blockade, Tigray in northern Ethiopia was cut off from the outside world since mid-2021. The exact death toll from the brutal 2-year conflict still remains unknown. primarily because of the stringent media restrictions. A breakthrough was achieved on the 2nd of November last year in Pretoria, the administrative capital of South Africa, when the warring sides formally agreed to a ceasefire deal as a part of an African Union-led peace process.
Today is the beginning of a new dawn for Ethiopia, for the Horn of Africa, and indeed for Africa as a whole. Two parties in the Ethiopian conflict have formally agreed to the cessation of hostilities.
The cornerstone of the deal was the demobilization of the Tigrayan forces. Other key elements included the restoration of federal authority in Tigray region, resumption of essential services, unhindered access to humanitarian supplies, and protection of civilians, especially women, children, and other vulnerable groups. Honoring the deal, Tigrayan forces began to hand over their heavy weapons to the federal army. The complete surrender of weapons is expected to happen until the end of January. Since the signing of the November peace deal, the fighting has largely stopped. Rebels claim that they have disengaged 65% of their fighters from the front lines. Tigray People's Liberation Front spokesperson Getachew Reda tweeted his hope and expectation. But there is one major flaw in the ceasefire deal, which may potentially derail the peace process. Eritrea, which supported the Ethiopian army in the conflict, has chosen not to participate in the Pretoria talks. And Asmara has for now declined to comment on whether the Eritrean soldiers will leave the Tigray province. More than 2 million Ethiopians have been displaced in the conflict so far. Hundreds of thousands of others are living in near famine-like conditions. But will the surrender of arms by the Tigrayan forces end the bloodshed? At this moment, there are few who are willing to stick their neck out to say that peace will prevail in Ethiopia.
Thanks for watching World at War. And if you want to reach out to me with any suggestions or comments or feedback, please feel free to tweet to me on the Twitter handle that you see on your screens. I'm your host, Mohammed Saleh. I'll see you again next week.